Happy Friday, everybody. Special edition of the Entrepreneurial Web. Welcome. We're here at my restaurant, Della, in Brooklyn because the station is closed down this week. But me being my usual self, I'm not interested in stopping for anything. Do you want to introduce yourself before I butcher your last name?
Sure. My name is Belinda DiGiambattista. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thank you.
It's exciting to be here and talk about entrepreneurship.
You did a much better job with that than I would have.
Thank you. But you can practice for next time. So basically, I am a serial entrepreneur. After leaving the corporate world, I've spent, I guess, half my career in the corporate world, half my career as an entrepreneur. And I definitely, prefer this way of working and building a career. So I first launched into a food service management company that I owned for about 9 years. And I sold that a couple of years ago, and now I am working as a business coach.
And so before we get into everything that you've done, let's talk about background. You're a Southern girl.
Yes, I'm from North Carolina.
Did you know I was from Nashville?
I don't think so.
Yeah, no. I grew up in the South.
In June.
What's that?
I was there in June in Nashville.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, it's much different than we left in the late 80s.
Okay.
And yeah, it was a much different scene then. But yeah, my parents went to college. My mom's from Norfolk, Virginia. My dad's from Miami. And they went to college there, and I was born. They were in their early 20s, not even out of school yet. And we stayed there until I was about 10 years old.
Okay.
And then we moved back my mom moved us back to Norfolk to be close to her family. So I spent a lot of time in Virginia, right on the North Carolina border.
Yes, and I was just below the border, about an hour in Summerfield, outside of Greensboro.
Nice. And my brother actually, I think he lives in Raleigh.
Okay.
Right now. They all stayed. I got out of the South as soon as I could. I actually did my undergrad at Old Dominion.
Okay.
In Norfolk, and then moved to Rochester, did my grad degree in Buffalo, and then we moved here right after. So you went to NYU, is that right?
For graduate school.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had a similar journey. I went to UNC Chapel Hill for undergraduate.
Gotcha.
So I was there, and then lived back in Greensboro for a couple of years at a bank, working at a bank, and then I left when I was 24, and we went to San Francisco.
What bank did you work for?
BB&T.
BB&T. I had one of my first adult accounts at a BB&T in Virginia Beach. So my mom worked for what became Bank of America.
Yep.
She started in Nashville. I think it was
Wachovia or a smaller bank?
Smaller, probably. I think Sovereign.
Okay.
For a little while, and so she went to school for music like myself, and like most of us that went to school for music, we had to get a real job because this is hard to pay the bills. And she, again, she had me while she was still in her undergrad, and I don't know, she started as like a bank teller, and then it worked all the way up to manager, like teller manager, and then she got into like high-level loans, where she was working, in a corporate building and not dealing with, customers like.
And that was the majority of my experience. I was working in loan administration, and I did get to go on some client calls because my job was to support the bankers that were the customer-facing people, and I would underwrite the deals. And then on occasion, they would let me out of the corporate building and go visit the local offices in Greenville, South Carolina, and Asheville, North Carolina, Greenville, South Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina, and get to meet some customers and tour some plants.
Yeah, when she went into the corporate building, she had done most of her time, specifically with dealing with customers, on a very intimate level in a branch, like your local branch. It was like your local banker. And they started this was in the mid-90s, I guess, and they just started cutting people, like chop, 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 chop. And her higher up started to go, and she was like, man, I'm not waiting for the guillotine to come down. So she went back and got her master's in music education. She had studied performance in her undergrad and pursued the teaching path, which she's done since then. And it was interesting because that's what got me into school.
Right.
Because prior to that, I was like, fuck school, I'm not doing this. I actually dropped out of high school. And I was just working and like managing bands and playing. And she was at Old Dominion doing music. And she was like, "You should come check out the music school there." And it just worked out. So otherwise, if Bank of America hadn't started cutting people, I might still be doing plumbing installation. Who knows?
Exactly. So there's always a reason for everything. That's the moral of the story.
Yeah. And were you studying business the whole time? Your
time.
undergrad was in business, so
Yeah.
this was like...
This is where I am completely opposite from you. I started taking accounting classes in 10th grade.
Yeah. Good student. You're like my wife. Yeah.
I was like on the front row.
Yeah.
And knew all about my debits and credits and, two-part posting. So I always enjoyed that part of, school. So I went to Carolina, went to business undergrad at Keenan Flagler, and went into banking. So I actually, before I had that first job in the bank, I did work for an entrepreneur for a year.
Okay.
So I did have a little bit of an introduction to what that was like. And it was a guy who was an engineer. And he created these little parts that went on, this was also in the, I guess, very early 90s. And he created parts that went on, I guess, a motherboard that was these little, he used these lasers. I'm not even sure. It went into cameras. It was very technical, and I had no idea what he did.
Right.
But he gave me the spiel, right? He taught me the pitch. And so my job was to take all the companies from the trade show that he would go to and call them all and say, hi, I'd like to speak to the person who's in charge of blah, 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 blah. And I would read it all, and I actually got a sale. I made a sale, $100,000 sale.
Nice.
That paid for all our bills for the year.
Yeah,
so
that's amazing.
I learned a lot. I was everything except the engineer in that, in that job. Like, I was the one employee.
And you can't be at all. Have you read the E-Myth? Do you know that book?
No, but every single person I talked to has read that.
It's good. I'm only like halfway through it, but it's interesting. He talks about working. I can't remember now. It's like working for your company versus working at your company.
Right. Yes, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, and it's like that's like the the entrepreneurial conundrum, right? Like.
Oh yeah.
Are you a slave to your business?
Exactly. I talk a lot about that with my clients.
Yeah, it's really important. And reading that was eye-opening for me because a lot of what I've done has been hands-on, and it's very easy to fall into that that trap where you feel like you have to do everything. And I think you always need to be relevant in a way where if shit goes down and whatever, some guy hacks his arm off, especially if you're like having an assembly line or something. I see these horrible videos of guys getting sucked into machines. Like, you got to be able to, you got to take care of him, but you got to be able to keep going in some way.
Absolutely.
But having that ability to not be the engineer, or have somebody, if you are the engineer, have somebody else who can deal with growth and outreach like yourself.
Right, you have to kind of start with
like
a vision and a plan and understand, to where you want to grow it, because there's some people who they get to a certain point and it's a lifestyle business and it's working for them and they're like, this is kind of good for me. And as long as you understand the pipeline of customers and you have, a feeder for that lifestyle business, it's fine. But if you have a bigger plan, then you definitely have to think about who you are grooming and how you're putting them in place, and that can lead to some very hard decisions.
Sure, I mean, just hard decisions regardless, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And like yourself, I got that experience early on too with people that own their own business, and even some family members, like my grandfather had done that. And the funny part for me was I didn't understand it or recognize it as entrepreneurship.
Right.
I really didn't know what that meant for a long time. Even somebody said something to me once, this was almost 10 years ago, and they're like, oh, you're a regular entrepreneur. And I was just like, is that an insult? Like, what are you saying to me? I just really didn't understand it.
Yeah.
It was a foreign notion to me. And the definition has grown for me over the years. Has it been the same for you, where what you understood it at first has evolved?
Absolutely.
So you want to talk about that for a few minutes?
Yeah, so my dad was the town jeweler, and I never thought of him as an entrepreneur. But he totally is.
He had the T-shirt for
exactly.
sure.
Oh,
wow.
Man. T-shirts, pins, highlighters, you name it. We had all the swag.
That's funny.
And he also, and my grandfather taught him how to become a jeweler. He was more or less an apprentice. He didn't go to college.
Yeah.
He just basically put a shingle out when he was 20 years old, and now over 40 years later, he still has a shingle out and has grown in other ways. He's found his path. He was definitely the type of person who did not want to let go of management. He considered different times opening up multiple stores, but then realized what that would require.
You got to let those reins go.
And that was just not in the cards. So he's decided to invest in real estate and have other ways to plan for his,
which is very entrepreneurial
portfolio. I don't think
he
he uses that word.
Right.
And so But my entire life, I grew up going to the jewelry store, waiting on customers out front.
And he still has the business.
He still has the business.
That's great. Awesome.
And my grandparents were farmers, but that was basically my summer job when I was a kid. Working on the farm.
If you're in the South, I did the same thing.
Yeah,
I worked at my grandfather's farm.
Vegetables.
Yep,
and,
absolutely.
Lots and lots of them, and then we would wash them, and then we went to the farmer's market 3 times a week. And so I have a big education in, watching my grandmother get to know her customers and know what they wanted and have everything ready for certain people who were there every single week.
Yep.
So just thinking back on all those experiences, and I do believe that led me to Butterbeans, which was the company that I started, which I don't think I even realized until 2 years into Butterbeans.
Oh, yeah.
So, it all comes to you. One day you're like, oh, this is all kind of fitting together for a reason, I'm sure.
So before we move on to Butterbeans, more specifically, your understanding of or definition of what, talking about your grandparents and your father being a small business owner, differing from what you're doing now and your vision now versus then, because I grew up very similarly where my grandfather owned a local business and he had a local farm, and I would work and help out with both, and he would have me going door to door selling stuff, and they would have these big things in the parking lot where he had a TV and appliance store.
We had the theater parking lot.
Yeah. And I didn't consider that, I didn't think of that as any kind of entrepreneurial thing. It was just like what they did, and then I grew up working for a lot of people like that, in addition to small stints working for larger corporations. And even after I started opening my own businesses and running them, I still didn't think of it as entrepreneurship. And I would say only lately I've gotten some nuances where I'm like, I might be an entrepreneur.
Right, yeah. So for me, it started out with this notion of owning your own business.
Right, absolutely.
So whenever I was working at the most recent corporate job in finance on Wall Street, the way it worked is, you had a paycheck, and for me, of course, I made less than my male counterparts, which was obvious and frustrating, but the way it was. And to the point where someone I was allowed to hire on my team made more money than me. So it was pretty egregious.
That sucks.
And every year there was a performance evaluation, right? And they would rate you 1 to 5, and based on that, you get a bonus. And it was extremely finite, right? It's so limited. And this is, you can grow into this, right? And so I was like, do I want to live my life where someone else is always going to be in charge of my financial ability?
Right.
I don't think so. I want to own my own business. So this was the way that I thought about it. I want to own my own business so that I can be the one to work as hard as I want and make as much money as I can. And
prior to that, you had never done anything specifically on your own?
I did a couple of pop-ups just to kind of experiment with it before, but nothing so serious. I figured this out. I'm going for it. Exactly. Yeah. And so at that point, that's the way I thought about it, owning my own business.
It was the same for me.
And then I went to graduate school, and there was not even really an entrepreneurship class.
Well, that's what I was curious about.
In the early 2000s.
Was it even mentioned?
They called it something else. They called it corporate venturing. They called it, then there was entrepreneurship.
They called it, you're going to die.
They called it entrepreneurship, where you can still work for a large company and be on a side project where you get to run things, but it's for, it's for GM. It's not for you.
The money goes somewhere else.
So they talked about it, and they had started the NYU business plan competition, around that time. And so NYU had started to pick up on it, but it wasn't really until I started to read magazine articles that I started to understand. And I would read an article that said, oh, such and such a company grew to X number of millions of dollars, sold for this many millions of dollars after 7 years. So I would read stories like this and say, I'd like to do that.
Yeah.
This is like something I want to do. I want that experience.
Yeah.
So that's the point where I started to think of myself as an entrepreneur.
Gotcha.
And interested in entrepreneurial ventures. So when I started Butterbeans, it was with the intention of growing something, starting something from scratch, growing it, running it, operating it, and selling it.
Gotcha.
So even from the very first day, that was the intention.
So do you consider that quintessential to the entrepreneurial experience?